Chapter 1. A Body in the Library. The rain had been falling steadily since dusk, turning the gravel path that led to Marlowe Manor into a slick ribbon of grey. In the distance, the grand estate loomed, its turrets piercing the heavy clouds, ivy crawling across its cold stone walls like ancient veins. The manor had stood for over 2 centuries on the edge of Surrey's forested countryside, a symbol of old wealth and deeper secrets. But tonight, its windows glowed not with warmth, but with the soft flicker of tension. At precisely 9:46 p.m., the local constable received a distress call. "This is Charles Marlowe," the man's voice had said, tight with panic. "It's my mother, Lady Eleanor. I think she's dead." By the time the police arrived, the storm had reached its crescendo, and the narrow lanes leading to the estate were beginning to flood. Inside the manor, the air was thick with old wood polish, pipe smoke, and something far more sinister: stillness. Lady Eleanor Marlowe was found in the library, slumped in her favourite leather armchair beside the fireplace. Her right hand dangled lifelessly over the side, a half-full glass of Glenfiddich clutched between her fingers. On the floor near her feet lay a shattered pocket watch, its glass cracked, its copper hands frozen at 8:07 p.m. The flames in the hearth crackled low, casting flickering shadows over her lifeless face. She had been dead for at least an hour. Eleanor Marlowe was no ordinary woman. At 72, she was as sharp-tongued as she was sharp-minded. A former Cambridge professor, she had taken over the family estate after her husband's death and managed it with military precision. The villagers knew her as Lady Marlowe, an imposing figure in a wide-brimmed hat and walking cane who never smiled but always paid her dues. She had amassed a considerable fortune through a mix of property investments and ruthless estate management. Many admired her, some feared her, and as it would soon become clear, a few may have hated her enough to want her dead. The initial examination found no signs of forced entry. The library doors were locked from the inside. The French windows at the far end were bolted shut, their frames dry, despite the downpour outside. Nothing had been stolen, no valuables disturbed. Only the broken watch stood out as unusual, out of place, almost deliberately so. Detective Inspector Clark, the senior officer on scene, frowned as he looked around. The case felt wrong. It was too quiet, too neat. She wasn't the kind to go peacefully, Clark muttered to himself, peering into Eleanor's cold, pale face. By midnight, the conclusion was unofficially drawn. Suspicious circumstances. They needed someone with experience in solving impossible puzzles, someone with a knack for reading not just the clues, but the people. Chapter 2. The Arrival of Luther. The black cab rolled to a stop on the slick driveway of Marlowe Manor just past 2 a.m. The rain had softened to a mist now, whispering across the windows and roof, like nature itself, holding its breath. A tall figure stepped out, broad-shouldered, trench coat buttoned to the collar, his dark eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat. Detective John Luther had arrived. He paused before approaching the door, taking in the silhouette of the manor, a sleeping beast of brick and stone. Its towering chimneys and carved archways loomed like ghosts in the night. For a moment, he did nothing. He simply listened. Inside, the manor was tense. Officers moved quietly from room to room, their voices hushed, as though afraid to wake the house itself. The warmth from the fireplaces barely touched the long, draughty corridors. The scent of wax polish, damp books and faint tobacco smoke clung to the air. Inspector Clark greeted Luther in the front hall, his brow furrowed, tie slightly loosened. "John," he said with a sigh, "glad you came." "You wouldn't have called me unless it was messy," Luther replied, removing his coat and shaking. "She was found like this by her son Charles," Clark said. "Claims he came looking for her when she didn't come down for supper. We're estimating time of death around 9:30 p.m., but then there's this—" He gestured to the broken watch. Luther picked it up delicately in gloved hands, examining it under the lamp's glow. "Deliberately placed," he muttered. "No blood on it. No glass shards on her shoes. Someone wanted to throw us off." Clark nodded grimly. "There's more. No signs of forced entry. Doors were locked from the inside. Windows, too." "So it's someone from the inside," Luther concluded. "Classic." Clark handed him a preliminary family chart and the incident report. 3 children, Charles, Isla, and Henry, all were home. Staff includes a cook, a housekeeper, and a groundskeeper, all accounted for. Nobody saw anything unusual, except— He trailed off and glanced toward the hallway. "Except," Luther prompted, "Mrs. Blanche, the housekeeper, said she thought she heard Lady Eleanor arguing with someone in the library around 8:15. A man's voice, but she couldn't say who, said it could have been the radio." Luther straightened up, placing the watch on a side table. "No radio in here." He walked the perimeter of the room slowly, taking in every detail. The angle of the desk chair, a half-written letter in Eleanor's hand, the faint scent of lavender and cigars, the fireplace poker still warm. Not recently used, leftover heat perhaps. The room was tidy, too tidy, and in Luther's experience, tidy murder scenes lied. Back in the hallway, Charles stood stiffly by the staircase, arms folded across his chest. His eyes flicked up as Luther approached. "I understand you found your mother?" Luther asked, calm and polite. Charles cleared his throat. "Yes, around 9:30. She hadn't come down for dinner. I thought it was strange." "Was she expecting any visitors tonight?" Nothing unusual. She was her usual self, stern, private." Luther tilted his head. "And the will?" Chapter 3. The Family Web. The drawing room was vast, dimly lit, and lined with oil portraits of ancestors who stared down with silent judgment. The Marlowes, Luther thought, had the kind of legacy that outlived affection. He stood by the fireplace, watching the family settle into their places like actors, taking positions on a worn-out stage. Charles Marlowe sat on the edge of a velvet armchair, jaw tight, his eyes darting between his siblings. He wore the stiffness of someone used to giving orders but unused to losing control. Isla Marlowe, wrapped in a dark green shawl that brought out her angular features, perched by the window, sketchbook still in hand. She didn't look up. Instead, her charcoal pencil scratched absently at the page, something vague and abstract taking shape. Behind her, the youngest of the 3, Henry, stood quietly near the liquor cabinet, pouring himself a glass of sherry with trembling hands. Luther broke the silence. "I'd like to speak to each of you," he said. "But first, I need to understand your mother." The room tensed. Charles cleared his throat. "She was complicated. Strict," Isla added without looking up. "And proud. Everything had to be done her way or no way." "She hated change," Henry said softly. "She didn't like us leaving or failing." Luther nodded slowly. "Let's talk about the will." Charles sat forward. "She mentioned updating it. I assumed I'd still manage the estate, but lately she's been cold, distant, secretive." "You've had financial problems," Luther said flatly. Charles stiffened. "Yes, but I never asked her for help." Isla scoffed. "You didn't have to. She always bailed you out, like clockwork." Luther glanced at her. "And you, Miss Marlowe?" She finally looked up, her eyes sharp and intelligent. "She disapproved of me. I became an artist, moved to Brighton. That was reason enough to be cast out. And yet, here you are." She summoned us all back for her birthday last week, Isla said, folding her sketchbook shut. A rare event. She said she had an announcement to make but never delivered it. Henry spoke again, barely above a whisper. She was planning to change the will, cut us all out. She was going to leave the manor to a heritage trust. The room fell still. Luther's eyes narrowed. And how do you know that? Henry looked down into his glass. I overheard her speaking to her solicitor on the phone. Which would give any of you a motive, Luther said evenly. Losing the inheritance, the estate, the control. That's absurd, Charles snapped. We may not have always agreed with her, but we wouldn't kill our own mother. Luther raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Instead, he turned his gaze to the portraits above the fireplace. Chapter 4. Tea and Lies. Morning came late to Marlowe Manor. The sun, veiled behind thick grey clouds, cast no warmth over the ivy-covered estate. Inside, the drawing room had been rearranged. A silver tea service stood polished on the sideboard. Fresh logs had been placed in the hearth, and a quiet hush settled over the walls. Heavy, watchful. Detective John Luther arrived shortly after 9 a.m., his coat still damp from the mist outside. He'd spent the early hours reading Lady Eleanor's personal letters and speaking briefly with the staff. Now he was ready to press deeper. The family had gathered as requested. Charles wore a crisp shirt, freshly ironed, though the dark circles beneath his eyes betrayed a sleepless night. Isla appeared in a navy turtleneck, barefoot, her hair tied back in a loose knot. Henry looked more dishevelled than before, his collar misaligned, his eyes flickering with unease. A tea tray was brought in by Mrs. Blanche, the aging housekeeper, with stiff joints and a sorrowful gaze. She poured silently as the siblings watched her, saying nothing. The clink of china and the soft rustle of linen were the only sounds in the room until Luther broke the silence. Your mother preferred Earl Grey, he said, casually inspecting a teaspoon. Blanche nodded. 2 sugars, no milk. Luther turned to the family. Last night I was told Lady Eleanor hadn't been herself recently, withdrawn, isolated. I'd like each of you to tell me what you noticed, truthfully. Charles folded his arms. She didn't confide in us. She never really did. Her business was her own. She became paranoid, Isla said, eyes on her. Luther studied him. Did she mention names? Enemies? Henry shook his head, but didn't meet Luther's gaze. There was something fractured about the dynamic. An invisible current ran between them. Resentment? Fear? Secrets layered beneath every pause. Luther took a sip of tea and set the cup down. Mrs. Blanche, he said, turning to the housekeeper, you told me you heard voices coming from the library last night, around 8:15. Was Lady Eleanor speaking with one of her children? Blanche hesitated. I couldn't tell. I only caught fragments. A man's voice, angry. Hers was calm, clipped, then a door shut. You're sure it was the library? Yes, sir. Luther looked at Charles. Where were you at that time? In the study, reviewing estate paperwork. I didn't leave until nearly 9. Isla smirked faintly. That's funny. I passed the study twice. It was empty. Charles glared at her. You're lying. I'm observant, she shot back. Luther intervened. Miss Marlowe, where were you? In the garden, she said, shrugging. Sketching under the covered archway. It was quiet until the thunder started. Luther turned to Henry. And you? I was upstairs, reading. I didn't come down until after the power flickered. Luther nodded slowly, taking in the mismatched accounts. Here's what I find interesting, he said. Your mother was planning to change her will. She invited you all home under the pretense of a birthday celebration, only to say nothing. Then she ends up dead alone, in a locked room. And none of your stories line up. Charles stood abruptly. "Are we suspects now?" "No," Luther replied calmly. "You're puzzles, and I intend to solve you." A tense silence followed. Isla reached for a biscuit and broke it neatly in half. "What do you think happened, Detective?" "I think," Luther said, rising, "someone in this room was more afraid of Eleanor Marlowe alive than dead." He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "And I think she knew it." As his footsteps echoed down the corridor, the siblings sat in uneasy quiet. Outside, the wind stirred the trees. Inside, the air had shifted. The illusion of unity had... Chapter 5. Shadows in the Attic. The attic at Marlowe Manor was a forgotten world. Dust hung in the air like old secrets, stirred only by the faint breath of wind through warped rafters. Beneath a sagging ceiling, trunks lay sealed with tarnished locks, and spiderwebs connected ancient boxes like veins through memory. Luther climbed the narrow steps carefully, the wooden staircase creaking under his weight. He didn't believe in ghosts, but the attic made him consider the idea. Earlier that morning, Mrs. Blanche had mentioned something strange. "She started going up there again, sir," she'd said, eyes wide. "Late at night. Sometimes with papers. Sometimes with nothing at all." "Did she bring anything down?" Luther asked. "No," she'd replied. "But once I saw her crying, first time in 20 years. Now, with a flashlight in one hand and a notepad in the other, Luther walked the length of the attic, scanning the forgotten corners. He found what he was looking for at the far end, beneath a dust-streaked dormer window, a narrow writing desk, small enough to fit in a child's bedroom. It had been wiped clean recently. Unlike the rest of the attic, there was no dust on its surface, no cobwebs on the nearby chair. Luther opened the drawer. Inside were several envelopes, all addressed in a neat, sharp hand, to Isla, to Henry, to Charles. None were sealed. He pulled them out carefully, unfolding the first, addressed to Isla. "Dearest Isla, you must forgive me. I should have protected you all better, but there are things I cannot explain, even now. The past is no longer asleep. I fear someone has awakened." Luther frowned, setting the letters aside. He opened the bottom drawer and discovered a faded folder, its edges brittle with age. Inside were legal papers, clippings, and a single black and white photo of a much younger Eleanor Marlowe, standing beside a tall man whose face had been partially scratched out. A name was scrawled beneath it in ink, Edgar Vale. He flipped to the newspaper clipping. "Local school headmaster resigns amid scandal." Edgar Vale, head of St. Michael's Boys' Academy, stepped down following allegations of financial misconduct and improper conduct with students. No charges were filed. The article was dated 1977. The final page was a handwritten list. Vale Estate, Sussex, sold Enfield Trust payout, received, legal agreement, confidential. Do not contact again. Luther exhaled slowly. So Eleanor had secrets, dangerous ones, enough to blackmail perhaps, enough to kill for. He took photographs of the documents and slipped the letters back into place. Descending from the attic, Luther nearly collided with Henry on the landing. The young man looked startled, but tried to smile. "Didn't mean to sneak up." "Funny," Luther replied. "You always see." Chapter 6. A Glove in the Garden. The garden had changed overnight. What had once been manicured hedges and pristine gravel paths now appeared wild and disordered, as if the very soil sensed the storm brewing within the house. Ivy curled over forgotten benches, and raindrops clung to rose petals like tiny, trembling secrets. Detective John Luther stepped through the arched trellis into the eastern portion of the garden, the part Eleanor had called her sanctuary. According to Mrs. Blanche, she'd often walked here late at night, even in winter, sometimes barefoot, sometimes in her robe. Once, she was found asleep on the stone bench, shivering but stubborn. Luther moved slowly, scanning the damp ground. A gust of wind rustled the trees, sending leaves skittering across the cobblestones. He paused near the old greenhouse, its windows fogged from within, the door hanging slightly ajar. Inside, the glass structure was dense with overgrowth. Dead vines twisted around rusted shelves, and cracked terracotta pots lay toppled among dried soil. Luther's eyes narrowed. Something pale was sticking out from a bed of wilted ferns near the far corner. He stepped forward and reached down. A glove, cream-colored leather, stained at the cuff with something dark. Mud or blood. Eleanor had been wearing gloves the night she died, but both had been accounted for. This was different, slimmer, newer, and it looked like it had been dropped recently. He turned it over. Embossed on the inner lining were faint initials. "I am Luther," exhaled sharply. "Eleanor Marlowe." He bagged the glove and stepped back outside, letting the door swing closed behind him. The wind was colder now. The manor loomed ahead, silent and immovable, but inside its walls lies had begun to stir. Back in the house, Luther found Isla alone in the conservatory, staring out at the fog-covered hills. She turned when he entered, but said nothing. He held up the evidence bag. "This yours?" Her eyes flicked to the glove. A pause. Then she nodded. "Yes, I lost it the night she died." "Lost or dropped?" Isla folded her arms. "Does it matter?" "Depends. You told me you were sketching in the garden during the storm, but this glove was found in the greenhouse. Why lie?" "I didn't lie," she said. "I moved. The rain started. I took cover. I was upset. I paced, and I wasn't thinking about alibis." "You were angry with her," Luther said. "She nearly cut you out of the will." "I was used to that. It wasn't about money." "What was it about?" Isla hesitated, her voice barely audible when she finally spoke. "Control. She controlled everything, even our memories." Luther studied her. "Is Edgar Vale your father?" She blinked. "What?" "I found a photograph. Eleanor and a man she'd tried to erase, literally. Your birth certificate lists no father." Isla's voice went tight. "I don't know who he was. She never told me." "But you suspected." "I had dreams," she whispered. A man watching from the trees, a voice that told me to be quiet. I thought they were just dreams. Luther took a breath. "Edgar Vale may have hurt someone. Your mother knew. She kept the evidence, and now she's dead." Isla looked away, her face pale. "So who else knew?" "That's what I'm trying to find out." That afternoon, Luther returned to the library. The crime scene had been tidied, but the heavy air remained. He paced the room slowly, stopping near the bookcase that had concealed the locked wall safe. The door had been opened by police on the night of the murder, but the contents, family bonds, deeds, one old diary, had seemed mundane. Now Luther examined the wall more closely. Behind the safe, a small round hole. Chapter 7. The Confession Room. The rain had stopped, but Marlowe Manor remained soaked in unease. The sky outside was a dull silver, light struggling to break through the clouds. Inside, Detective John Luther sat in Lady Eleanor's bedroom, alone with her silence. The room was pristine, untouched since her death. Her perfume still clung faintly to the drapes. The ivory piano in the corner had gone quiet for weeks, the sheet music left open on a nocturne she'd never finish. He sat in her chair and opened her diary, the one recovered from the safe. Most entries were mundane, weather, garden, occasional reflections on loneliness. But a series of pages near the end, written hastily in shaky handwriting, drew his attention. I heard the voice again, behind the wall. He's here. I know it. I don't know who to trust, not even my own blood. There are secrets buried beneath this house, and someone is digging them up." Luther set the diary down. He stared out the window, watching as the groundskeeper pushed a wheelbarrow down the gravel path, oblivious to the slow corrosion of truth inside the house. Someone had been tormenting Eleanor before she died. He rose and walked into the hall, where he found Mrs. Blanche dusting the hallway portraits. "Did Lady Eleanor ever speak of hearing voices?" he asked. Blanche hesitated. "Sometimes. She said there were things behind the walls. I thought it was nerves." "Did you believe her?" She nodded. "After the storm last month, she asked me to remove every mirror from her room, said she didn't want it watching anymore." "It?" She never said who, only that it had returned. Later that evening, Luther called the family into the sitting room. A fire flickered in the hearth. Shadows danced across their faces as they took their seats. Isla, guarded. Henry, twitchy. Charles, impassive. Luther stood. "I'm no longer asking questions. I'm going to tell you what happened." Henry suddenly stood and backed away. "You think it was me? You had access. You knew the house inside out. And you were the only one not accounted for when Eleanor died." "Because I was reading upstairs." Luther walked to the liquor cabinet and pulled out a small photo he had taped inside earlier that day. He tossed it onto the table. It was Eleanor crying in the attic. The photo had been taken from behind, and based on the grain and angle. It was taken by someone spying through the crawl space. He looked directly at Henry. "I found a camera in your room, hidden in a bookcase. Memory card intact." Henry froze. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I didn't kill her." "But you were watching her," Luther said, "weren't you?" Henry didn't answer. His hands trembled. Suddenly, Isla whispered, "Wait, then who did?" The door creaked open. Mrs. Blanche stepped in. She looked old, far older than earlier. In her hands, she held a small box. "I think it's time I tell you everything," she said. The room went silent. Chapter 8. Truth Beneath the Floorboards. The sitting room was still. The only sound was the ticking of the ornate clock above the hearth. Mrs. Blanche, Marlowe Manor's longtime housekeeper, stood at the centre, clutching a small wooden box, like it contained a beating heart. Detective Luther remained calm, but his eyes never left her. "You said you had something to share," he prompted. Blanche sat down gently, placing the box on the coffee table. Her hands trembled, whether from age or guilt. Luther couldn't yet tell. "I served Lady Eleanor for nearly 40 years, she began. "I watched this family grow, fracture, pretend. I kept their secrets because that was the rule here. But some things should never have been buried." She opened the box. Inside were newspaper clippings, a torn photograph, and a faded journal. The headline on top read, "Local boy disappears from St. Michael's. Investigation closed." "Eleanor's brother Marcus Vale went missing when he was 15, Blanche said softly. "No one in this house knows she had a brother, not even Isla." "Edgar Vale's son," Luther murmured. Blanche nodded. "She told me once, in a moment of drunken honesty, that her father wasn't just abusive, he was dangerous, and she believed he killed Marcus to cover something up. When the school protected him, Eleanor cut all ties. She changed her name, buried the past, and vowed never to speak of it again." Luther glanced at the children, Isla pale as snow. Charles looked stunned. Henry was still shaking. "But something changed," Blanche continued. 3 months ago a letter arrived, no return address, just a single sentence, "You can't hide from blood." "That's what triggered everything," Luther said. "Yes," Blanche whispered. She started seeing shadows in mirrors, hearing voices in the attic. She thought Edgar was alive, or someone pretending to be him. And she thought one of the children was helping him. She looked up at them. She didn't trust any of you, not fully. Why didn't you come forward? Isla asked. Because I promised her I never would, Blanche said. But when she was murdered, I realized promises to the dead mean little when the living are still in danger. Luther leaned forward. Mrs. Blanche, did you kill her? Her eyes welled with tears. Number, but I know who did. A silence so deep followed that even the clock seemed to pause. She turned, slowly, to face Charles. I found the bloodied poker behind your study bookshelf. You wrapped it in a linen napkin and tried to burn it in the furnace. But you didn't clean the handle. I saw the initials. It was yours. Charles stood abruptly. She was going to destroy the family, rewrite the will, give everything to Idla. What was I supposed to do? Just accept it? Accept her madness? So you killed her? Isla Susurro? I didn't mean to, Charles snapped. I just wanted to scare her, make her sign a different will. But she panicked. She grabbed a fire iron. We struggled. She fell, hit her head on the edge of the marble hearth. It was an accident. But you staged it like a murder, Luther said. Charles didn't deny it. Because I knew no one would believe me, not after what I'd done to her trust. Luther stood slowly. You'll have to come with me? But Isla's voice stopped them both. Wait. They turned. She stepped forward, her expression unreadable. Let me say goodbye, please. Luther hesitated, then gave her a nod. Isla approached Charles. Her voice dropped to a whisper only he could hear. You didn't just kill our mother. You killed whatever hope we had of healing. She stepped back. Charles's face fell. The weight of